Get your rag hair off my plane before I cut it.
She was 14 years old, alone, and sitting in a business class seat she had every right to be in. She had her carry-on bag tucked neatly overhead. She had her window seat. She had her book open on her lap and her grandmother's address folded carefully inside her jacket pocket. She had done everything right. She was prepared. She was polite. She was excited. And within 5 minutes of stepping onto that plane, a grown woman in a uniform decided that none of that mattered. Because of the way her hair looked, what happened over the next 4 hours at 35,000 feet would become one of the most talked about stories in the country. It would end careers, spark national conversations, and force an entire airline to look itself in the mirror. It would be shared millions of times across every platform, dissected by journalists, debated by commentators, and watched by people who couldn't look away, not because it was shocking, but because it was so devastatingly familiar. But here's the part that no one saw coming. The woman humiliating this 14-year-old girl had no idea, not the faintest clue, that the pilot flying that plane was the girl's mother. This is the story of Imani Clarke. And it begins the way so many great stories do, with a nervous kid, a packed suitcase, and a love so wide and deep it could stretch across a runway. Imani Clarke was the kind of 14-year-old that teachers wrote home about in the best possible way. She was quiet but never vacant. Observant in the way that writers are observant, noticing things that other people walk past without a second glance. The way light hit a puddle on the sidewalk. The way a stranger's face shifted when they thought no one was watching. She kept a journal that she'd been filling since she was 9 years old, and in it she wrote about everything, her dreams, her fears, the conversations she overheard in coffee shops, the way certain songs made her feel like she was standing at the edge of something enormous. She was tall for her age, with long natural locks that she had been growing since she was 6 years old. Her mother had started them for her on a rainy Saturday afternoon, sitting on the bathroom floor with coconut oil and patience and Stevie Wonder playing softly from a portable speaker. Each lock was a record of time, some thin and wispy at the root, others thick and heavy with years of growth. They fell past her shoulders now, wrapped in a few that Imani had decorated herself with small gold rings that caught the light when she moved. She was proud of her locks. Not in a loud, performative way. Just in the quiet, settled way that you're proud of something that is genuinely, wholly yours. Imani lived with her mother, Captain Yolanda Clarke, in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. Their apartment smelled like coffee in the morning and garlic in the evening, and the walls were covered in framed photographs and a few pieces of art that Imani had made herself. It was a small space, but an abundant one, full of books stacked in corners, houseplants that Imani watered with scientific dedication, and a kitchen table that had hosted more deep conversations than most conference rooms. Yolanda Clarke was 41 years old and had been flying commercial aircraft for 16 years. She was one of fewer than 300 black women currently serving as captains for major airlines in the United States, a fact that, depending on who you asked, was either a remarkable achievement or a damning indictment of an industry that had spent decades making the cockpit feel like it wasn't built for people who looked like her. Yolanda didn't spend a lot of time dwelling on that statistic. She had spent her whole life refusing to be defined by what she wasn't supposed to be. She had flown through weather systems that would make your knees buckle, navigated instrument failures at altitude, managed emergency landings with the kind of calm that passengers describe as surreal. She had been doing that job longer than some of her colleagues had been adults. She was exceptional, and she knew it the way that people who've worked brutally hard at something eventually know it, not arrogantly, just factually. But at home in their apartment she was just mom. The woman who burned toast on Sundays and sang off-key to old R&B while unloading the dishwasher. The woman who knew exactly how Imani liked her hot chocolate, extra cocoa, less sugar, a pinch of cinnamon she'd learned from Imani's grandmother. The woman who had taught her daughter to be proud, to be prepared, and to walk into any room like she belonged there. Because she always did. On the morning this story begins, Imani was flying alone for the first time. She was going to visit her grandmother. Grandma Celestine, or Grandma Cece, as Imani had been calling her since she first learned to talk, lived in New Orleans, in a house that had been in the family for 3 generations. It was an old Creole cottage on a street shaded by live oaks whose roots had long ago made peace with the sidewalk, cracking and lifting the concrete in ways that the city had simply incorporated into its texture, the way old places absorb damage and make it part of their character. The house had a wraparound porch where Grandma Cece kept 2 rocking chairs and a small table for her afternoon coffee. The garden was Celestine's primary occupation in retirement. She tended it with a kind of focused intensity usually reserved for surgery, which made sense because she had been a surgical nurse for 37 years and had brought that precision into every part of her life, including the hydrangea bush that turned violent shades of purple in the summer and the jasmine she'd trained up the porch railing over the course of 2 decades until it formed a canopy that smelled, on warm evenings, almost unbearably beautiful. The house smelled like good food and old wood and something sweet that Imani had never been able to name, but that she associated entirely with safety. With the particular safety of being completely, unconditionally known. Imani had been looking forward to this trip for 3 months. 3 months of calendars and countdowns, of packing lists revised and revised again, of conversations with Grandma Cece that each ended with "not long now, baby." She and her grandmother had a tradition. Every summer, Imani spent 2 weeks in New Orleans, and those 2 weeks were some of the richest of her year. Not because anything spectacular happened, though sometimes it did, because New Orleans is a city with a particular talent for the spectacular, but because of what those 2 weeks felt like. Grandma Cece cooked with her, walked with her through the French Quarter in the slow-moving evenings when the heat had dropped a few degrees and the city came back to life. Told her stories about the family that Yolanda, caught up in the operational demands of a demanding life, never quite got around to telling. The kind of stories that explained why certain people were the way they were, why certain choices had been made, why the Clarke women had always carried themselves a particular way through a world that sometimes needed reminding who it was dealing with. Head up, back straight, eyes forward, Grandma Cece always said. Not because the world deserves your best posture. Because you do. Imani had been hearing this since she was 5 years old. It was the Clarke family motto, expressed not in Latin on a crest but in the plain, practical language of a woman who had spent her life navigating systems that were not designed for her and had refused, with absolute consistency, to let them make her small. Yolanda had driven Imani to the airport herself that morning, which was already a logistical miracle given that Yolanda was scheduled to pilot the same route 4 hours later. The timing worked, barely, and it worked because Yolanda had engineered it to work, the way she engineered most things in her life, with meticulous planning, a backup plan, and an awareness of every possible variable. They'd arrived 2 hours early, moved through security with practiced efficiency, and found a seat at the gate together, in the particular way that mothers and daughters sit together at airports, close, comfortable, no wasted space between them. Yolanda had gone over everything twice. Boarding pass, seat number, confirmation code, the phone number for the gate agent if anything went wrong, the number for the airline's customer service line, Grandma Cece's number, which Imani had memorized years ago but which Yolanda made her recite again anyway. The airline's unaccompanied minor protocol, which Imani had technically aged out of, but which Yolanda had reviewed anyway, because she was a pilot and a mother, and those 2 things together meant she reviewed everything twice and never apologized for it. Business class, Imani said, looking at her boarding pass with a small smile. You didn't have to do that. I wanted you comfortable, Yolanda said simply. She tucked a strand of Imani's locks behind her ear, a gesture she'd been making since Imani was small, an automatic, affectionate thing. You've got your book. You've got your headphones. You've got your snacks. You know how to ask for what you need. You're going to be fine.
Mom.
I know I'm going to be fine. I know you know. Yolanda smiled, the real one, the one Imani had grown up with. I'm reminding myself. Imani laughed. You're going to be flying the same plane 4 hours later. You literally can't worry about me. You'll have actual responsibility. I contain multitudes, Yolanda said, which made Imani laugh again, because her mother had been saying this for as long as Imani could remember, and it was still funny, in the way that the most reliable jokes are funny, not because they're surprising, but because they're exactly right. They sat together until final boarding was called. Then Yolanda walked her daughter to the gate entrance, handed the boarding pass to the attendant on her behalf with a quiet authority that came naturally to her, and waited while the gate agent checked Imani's documents. She squeezed her daughter's hand once, firmly, briefly, saying everything she didn't have time to say, and watched her disappear down the jet bridge with her backpack on and her locks swinging gently behind her, gold rings catching the fluorescent light. She watched until she couldn't see her anymore. Then she stood at the gate entrance for another few seconds, looking at the empty jet bridge, before she turned and began walking back through the terminal toward her own pre-flight preparation. She was thinking about coffee, about the weather system they'd be navigating, about the pre-flight checklist, about the 1,000 small details that comprise the operational reality of moving a commercial aircraft from one city to another. She was not thinking about Debra Hollis, whom she had never met and had no reason to think about. She had no idea what was waiting for her daughter on the other side of that door. Imani boarded early, as business-class passengers do, and made her way down the narrow aisle with the quiet confidence her mother had modeled for her every day of her life. She found her seat, 4A, window, left side, and lifted her carry-on into the overhead bin. It took a moment. The bin was slightly high for her height, and she had to stretch, but she managed it. She settled into the seat, pulled out her book, a dog-eared copy of Octavia Butler's Kindred that she'd been reading for the second time, and exhaled slowly. She was doing it. She was actually doing it. Flying alone. Business class. To see Grandma Cece. She allowed herself exactly one moment of quiet, private excitement. A small smile. A deep breath. Then she opened her book and began to read. She was 3 pages in when she first noticed the flight attendant. The woman was moving through the cabin with a practiced, professional ease that looked like warmth from a distance, but felt like something else up close. She was white, mid-50s, with close-cropped silver blonde hair and a uniform that was pressed to a perfectionist standard. Her name tag read Debra. She had the kind of face that defaulted to a smile, not because she was particularly happy, but because a smile in her profession was a tool. It opened doors. It smoothed things over. It communicated, without words, that everything was fine, and that you were welcome, and that this space was for you. Imani would come to understand, over the next several hours, that Debra's smile was a highly targeted instrument. Debra moved down the cabin, pausing at each row, offering pre-departure drinks with practiced grace. The couple in 2A and 2B, white, well-dressed, early 60s, received a warm smile, a brief exchange about their destination, a recommendation for the champagne. The man in 3C, white, business suit, distracted by his phone, received a respectful nod and a quiet offer of still or sparkling water. Debra leaned in slightly to hear his preference, nodded again, moved on. She reached row 4. Something changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious, not at first. It was the kind of thing that, if you weren't paying attention, you might miss entirely. But Imani had been paying attention her whole life. She had been trained, the way that Black children are often trained without anyone actually saying the words out loud, to read rooms, to notice shifts, to detect the almost imperceptible change in temperature that meant something was wrong even when nothing visible had changed yet. Debra looked at Imani, and the smile not gone exactly, just different, slightly cooled, like it had been diluted with something that hadn't been there for the rows before. "Excuse me," Debra said. Her voice was pleasant, professionally pleasant. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Imani looked up from her book. "Sorry? Your boarding pass." A pause. Slightly too long. "I just want to confirm your seat assignment." Imani didn't flinch. She had seen this before, not on planes but in stores and libraries, in places where the message beneath the message was, "Are you sure you belong here?" She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out her boarding pass, and held it up calmly. Debra studied it for a moment that lasted just a beat longer than necessary. Then she looked up at Imani, and this was the part Imani would replay later, her gaze moved, just briefly, to Imani's locks. It was a glance. Half a second, maybe less. But it held something in it that a glance has no business holding. "Right," Debra said, handing the boarding pass back. "Thank you." And then, in a voice still coated in that professional polish, she said, "You may want to tuck your hair in a bit." It's quite voluminous. We don't want it to disturb the passenger behind you. Imani stared at her. The passenger behind her hadn't boarded yet. The seat was empty. Imani said nothing. She took her boarding pass back, folded it carefully, and returned it to her pocket. She turned back to her book. She did not tuck her hair. The plane finished boarding. The seat behind Imani was eventually filled by a white woman in her 30s who, in 4 hours of sitting directly behind Imani's Locs, would never once complain, shift uncomfortably, or indicate in any way that she was remotely bothered by anything. Debra did not ask her if she needed more space. As the plane prepared for pushback, Imani stole a glance around the business class cabin. There were 12 seats up here. She was the only black passenger. She noted this the way you note the weather. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't surprising. It was just a fact, like the altitude or the temperature, something that didn't require a reaction, just an awareness. She returned to her book. Takeoff was smooth. The city fell away beneath them, the grid of streets and rooftops dissolving into something abstract and beautiful, and Imani pressed her forehead briefly against the cool window and watched the world shrink. She loved this part. Her mother had taken her up in a small Cessna when she was 9, just the two of them, Yolanda in the pilot's seat and Imani beside her, and something had shifted in her permanently that day. The understanding that the world looked different from up here. That perspective was a function of altitude. She was thinking about that memory when the meal service began. This was when things escalated. Debra moved through the cabin with the same professional ease, the cart rolling smoothly, the options presented warmly. Chicken or pasta? Still or sparkling? The couple in 2A and 2B received a full explanation of both options, a recommendation of the chicken, and a small story about the catering company's partnership with a local restaurant that Debra seemed genuinely invested in sharing. The man in 3C received his pasta, without much fanfare, efficiently and correctly. Debra reached row 4. She stopped the cart. She turned to the passenger in 4C, a white man in his 40s who had slept through most of the flight so far. She gently woke him. She explained both options. She waited patiently while he deliberated. She smiled when he finally chose the chicken. And then she pushed the cart forward. Past row 4. Imani looked up from her book. She watched the cart move to row 5. She watched Debra offer options to the passengers in row 5. She looked back toward the cart's path, confirming she hadn't somehow misread what had just happened. She hadn't. Debra had looked directly at her. Imani had seen it, a flicker of eye contact, brief and deliberate, and then moved past without a word, without an offer, without so much as a gesture toward the cart. Imani sat with this for a moment, the confused, slightly nauseated feeling of having been rendered invisible by someone who was paid to see you. She told herself it was a mistake. She told herself Debra would come back. She returned to Octavia Butler and tried to concentrate on the words on the page. Debra did not come back. The cart completed its full journey through the cabin and was wheeled back toward the galley. The entire business class cabin had been served. Every passenger, except one. Imani's tray table was empty. She pressed the call button above her seat. It was Sandra who appeared, younger than Debra, early 30s, with a wide, slightly uncertain smile. Sandra was the second flight attendant assigned to the business class cabin, and she had been present for most of what had happened without, it must be said, doing anything about any of it. "Hi," Imani said, her voice even. "I wasn't given a meal during the service." Sandra's expression flickered, something moving behind her eyes that might have been recognition, might have been guilt. "Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Let me check what we have left." She disappeared. She came back 3 minutes later with a small plate that was clearly an afterthought, a bread roll, a portion of pasta that had been sitting in its container for the better part of an hour, and a plastic cup of water. It was the same meal the other passengers had received, except theirs had been presented on proper trays with linen napkins and a small side salad and a warm bread roll straight from the basket. Imani looked at the plastic cup of water. She said, "Thank you," because she had been raised to be gracious even when the world wasn't, and she ate the bread roll and left the pasta untouched. 40 minutes later, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, This is a reminder that we have an unaccompanied minor on board today. If the young passenger in business class could please remain seated and refrain from moving through the aircraft unaccompanied, we appreciate your cooperation. Imani had not moved. She had not gotten up once since takeoff. She had not walked through the cabin, asked to visit the cockpit, or done anything that could conceivably be described as requiring a public announcement. The couple in 2A and 2B turned briefly to look. The man in 3C glanced over his shoulder. The woman in the seat behind Imani, the one whose view had apparently been so at risk from Imani's Locs, looked at her with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and discomfort. Imani kept her eyes on her book. She turned a page she had not read. It was around this point that Marcus Webb started paying attention. Marcus was in seat 5, one row behind and across the aisle, and he had spent the first hour of the flight doing what most business travelers do, working through emails, staring at a spreadsheet, negotiating internally with himself about whether to order a second coffee. He was 43, a broad-shouldered man with glasses and a quiet, watchful energy. He had 3 daughters. The oldest was 15. He had noticed the boarding pass check. He had noticed the meal service skip. He had heard the PA announcement. And something in him, some bone-deep, paternal alarm system had been activated. He pulled out his phone. He opened the camera. He set it on his tray table, angled toward the front of the cabin, and pressed record. He didn't know what he was recording yet. He just knew that something was happening that should be witnessed. An hour into the flight, Imani reached up to retrieve something from her carry-on, her headphones, which she had forgotten to pull out before stowing her bag. She was standing in her seat, stretching up toward the overhead bin, when the latch caught awkwardly and the bag shifted. It wasn't an emergency. It was the kind of thing that happens to everyone who has ever interacted with an overhead bin on any commercial flight in history. A stuck latch, a slightly jammed position. She was working on it quietly, not distressed, not panicked, just mildly inconvenienced, when Debra appeared at the front of the cabin. And then, almost immediately, disappeared back into the galley. Imani noticed this. She filed it away. She was still working on the bin when, 2 rows ahead of her, the gentleman in 2B stood up and reached toward his own overhead bin. His briefcase had shifted during turbulence earlier and was now sitting at an awkward angle. He barely touched it before Debra materialized at his shoulder, smiling, offering her assistance with the kind of swift efficiency that airlines put in brochures. "Let me get that for you, sir." She repositioned his briefcase. She smiled again. She patted his arm lightly, a tiny, warm gesture of human connection, and returned to the galley. Imani had watched all of this. So had Marcus Webb, whose camera had not stopped recording. She finally worked the bin open herself, retrieved her headphones, and sat back down. She put them on. She looked out the window at the blue-white expanse of cloud below. She was 14 years old. She was alone. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She would not cry. She had decided that on the ground, before any of this started, in the way that children who have grown up navigating the world's particular cruelties decide things, quietly, in advance, before the moment arrives. She would not give Debra Hollis the satisfaction of her tears. But her eyes, if you had been close enough to see them, would have told a different story. Let me pause right here for just a moment because I need to ask you something. Can you imagine sitting there as a 14-year-old, excited for your first solo trip, flying to see your grandmother, doing everything right and being treated like you're invisible? Like you don't belong in the seat you paid for? Like your hair, your beautiful, natural crown of hair, is somehow an inconvenience? What would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed silent? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know. And while you're down there, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one deserve to be heard, and we tell them every single week. It was somewhere over the middle of the country, that vast, anonymous corridor of farmland and highway that stretches between coasts, when Imani reached into her jacket for something to read and her hand found, instead, the photograph. She had almost forgotten it was there. Her mother had tucked it into her jacket pocket the night before, with the quiet, slightly embarrassed tenderness that Yolanda used whenever she was doing something sentimental. "For the journey," was all she'd said. Imani had laughed, told her she was being dramatic, and then had secretly kept the jacket close all evening because she liked knowing the photograph was in there.
She pulled it out now.
It was a photograph that Imani knew well, had known since she was small enough to need it explained to her. In it, her mother stood on a tarmac in full captain's uniform, navy jacket, for gold stripes on each sleeve, hat straight and serious. She was standing in front of a wide-body aircraft, one of the big ones, the kind that carries hundreds of people across oceans, and she was smiling. Not the careful, composed smile of someone performing for a camera. The real one. The one Imani had grown up with, the one that said, "Look what I built. Look where I am. Look who I am." Yolanda had been 36 when that photograph was taken. The youngest black female captain in the airline's history at that point. The photograph had run in a magazine, one of those short feature pieces about trailblazers and firsts, and they'd framed it together, Imani and her mother, and hung it in the hallway at home. But Yolanda had also kept a print, worn at the edges from being folded and refolded, that she'd given to Imani years ago as a kind of talisman. "So you always know," she'd said, "that the ceiling isn't real." Imani held the photograph in both hands and looked at her mother's face. The 4 gold stripes. The steady eyes. The smile that wasn't asking anyone's permission. A voice from the next seat said quietly, "Is that your family?" The woman who had eventually taken the aisle seat in Imani's row, she'd boarded late, had barely spoken, was looking at the photograph with polite curiosity. She was white, perhaps 40, with tired eyes and a softness to her that felt genuine rather than performed. Imani looked at the photograph, then back at the woman. "That's my mom," Imani said. "She flies this route a lot, actually." The woman smiled vaguely. Then she looked again at the photograph. Then her smile shifted, moved into something more alert, more uncertain. Her eyes went from the photograph to Imani's face. "She flies this route?"
"Yeah."
Imani folded the photograph carefully and tucked it back into her jacket. "She's a captain." The woman said nothing more. But something had changed in her expression, a recalibration, a quiet reorientation, and she spent the next several minutes looking from the cockpit door to Imani and back again with an expression that Imani didn't quite know what to do with. In 5A, Marcus Webb had caught the exchange on camera. He lowered his phone slowly, and then he looked at the cockpit door. And a thought began to form. The turbulence hit without much warning. These things rarely do. One moment the air is smooth and the aircraft is a reliable, humming machine, and the next moment the world lurches sideways and your coffee threatens to relocate itself to your lap and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign feels less like a gentle suggestion and more like a serious conversation. This was moderate turbulence, nothing dangerous, the kind that experienced flyers absorb without drama, the kind that first-time solo flyers meet with wide eyes and white knuckles. Imani gripped her armrests and reminded herself of every single thing her mother had ever told her about turbulence. That it was air movement, not structural failure. That planes were engineered for this, tested beyond this, designed to flex and absorb. That pilots flew through turbulence more or less every day, and it remained, statistically, one of the safest things you could do. She knew all of this. She believed all of this. She was still 14 and alone, and her knuckles were still white. The turbulence lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Then the air smoothed again. The aircraft settled back into its steady rhythm, and the seatbelt sign chimed off. And then the intercom opened. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was measured. Warm but authoritative in the specific way of people who have spent years being the voice that panicked passengers listen to when they need to hear that everything is going to be fine. Calm the way that only genuine competence produces calm. "We encountered some light chop there, just a patch of disturbed air over the midsection of our route. We're through it now, and expecting smooth air for the remainder of our descent into New Orleans. Current conditions on the ground are clear. Temperature is a very pleasant 79 degrees, and we're looking at an on-time arrival. We do have about 45 minutes remaining in our flight. On behalf of myself and the entire crew, thank you for flying with us today. We'll have you on the ground shortly." The intercom closed. The cabin was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. And then the woman in 4C, Imani's row, the aisle seat, turned and looked at Imani with an expression that was no longer vague or uncertain. It was wide open, almost stunned, because the captain's name, as it appeared on the flight information card in the seat pocket, on the gate display at departure, and in the airline's passenger app, Captain Y. Clarke, had just been spoken aloud by a voice that was, unmistakably, the same voice Imani had listened to across 14 years of bedtimes and breakfast tables and road trips and rainy afternoons. The woman didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She looked at Imani. She looked at the cockpit door. She looked at Imani again. And Imani, who had been quietly absorbing indignity for the past 3 hours, who had eaten a bread roll alone while 12 other passengers received full meals, who had listened to a public announcement designed to embarrass her, who had been told that her hair was a problem, who had watched a grown woman walk past her carry-on and rush to help a white man 2 rows away, Imani looked directly at Debra Hollis. And for the first time since she had boarded this aircraft, she smiled. Debra Hollis had heard the announcement too. Of course she had. It had come through the same intercom system she used every single day, the familiar click of the open channel, the professional cadence of a captain's standard post-turbulence communication. She'd been standing in the galley, going over post-service inventory with Sandra, and the captain's voice had been perfectly, unavoidably audible, clear as a bell in the close quarters of that small galley space. She had been working for this airline for 19 years. She had worked this route, this specific corridor, dozens of times. She was familiar with the rotation schedules in the general way that long-serving crew members became familiar with such things, not through memorization, but through exposure. She knew most of the regular pilots by sight, if not always by name. The industry was smaller than it looked from the outside. She did not know Captain Yolanda Clarke by name, had not paid particular attention to the captain's name on this morning's manifest. She rarely did. Cabin crew and cockpit crew moved through pre-flight preparation largely in parallel, and unless something required direct communication between the two, there was rarely occasion to pay close attention to the person behind that cockpit door. She had not paid close attention. Now she was paying attention.
Clarke.
Captain Y. Clarke. The name sat in her mind with a weight it hadn't carried 30 seconds ago. She was running the arithmetic that anyone would run, the calculation of coincidence and probability, the mental assessment of how common or uncommon that name was, whether this could be purely incidental. Clarke was not an unusual name. It could mean nothing. She was probably catastrophizing.
She knew she was not catastrophizing.
Because the arithmetic wasn't really the point. The arithmetic was a delay tactic, a way of buying a few more seconds before the full weight of what she had done settled on her completely. She had been in this industry long enough to know that some moments, once they arrived, could not be argued with. You could only stand in them and understand, with absolute clarity, what you had built. She thought about the boarding pass check, the comment about the hair, the skipped meal service, the PA announcement that she had made with her own voice through the aircraft's intercom system, directing it at a child who had not moved from her seat since takeoff, the overhead bin, the way she had glanced at the girl struggling with the latch and simply walked past, the way she had then moved, quickly and without being asked, to reposition a white passenger's briefcase 2 rows ahead.
Debra.
Sandra's voice, low and uncertain. The younger woman was looking at her with an expression that contained its own version of the same reckoning. Sandra, who had watched all of it unfold across 3 hours and had said nothing, who had brought the bread roll and the plastic cup of water and had told herself, perhaps, that doing something, even something inadequate, was not the same as being complicit. "Are you okay?" Debra didn't answer. She moved to the galley entrance and looked out at the business class seats. She could see the woman in 4C, who was looking at the girl in 4A with an expression that was somewhere between awe and discomfort. She could see Marcus Webb in 5A, whose phone had been face down on his tray table for the last several minutes in the specific, studied way of someone who is trying to be inconspicuous about something they are not, in fact, being inconspicuous about. She could see the couple in 2A and 2B who had been trading glances for the past 5 minutes with the particular body language of people who have just understood something that is making them reassess the last several hours. And she could see Imani Clarke, who was sitting in seat 4A with the posture of a much older woman, back straight, chin absolutely level, eyes steady, and who was looking directly at Debra with an expression that contained, in a precision that no 14-year-old should have needed to develop, absolutely nothing that could be called disrespectful, and absolutely everything that Debra had earned over the past 3 hours. It was the most quietly devastating thing Debra had seen in 19 years on this aircraft. She went back into the galley. She stood with her hands flat on the counter, pressing down into the cool steel surface, and she stayed very still for the remainder of the descent. She had never thought of herself as a person who discriminated. This, in the cold, clarifying arithmetic of the galley, was perhaps the most important thing she was thinking. She had never used that word about herself, would have resisted it vigorously, indignantly, if someone had applied it to her. She was a professional. She was consistent. She gave good service. She had always given good service. But standing there, with the full accounting of her afternoon arranged in her mind with a clarity she couldn't look away from, she understood, perhaps for the first time in 19 years, the difference between being a person who is not prejudiced and being a person who has simply never been forced to look. The descent into New Orleans was smooth. Below, the city came into focus slowly. The brown coil of the Mississippi, the dense green of the bayou, the geometric grid of neighborhoods spreading outward from a curve of river like rings from a stone dropped in still water. Imani pressed her face to the window and watched the city rise up to meet her. Grandma Cece was somewhere down there. Sweet olive and jasmine. The porch with the hanging fern. The kitchen where something was almost certainly already cooking. She thought about her mother's voice on the intercom. That voice she had heard every day of her life, suddenly transformed into the official, authoritative voice of the person responsible for this aircraft and everyone in it. She thought about how those two things fit together. The woman who burned toast on Sundays and the woman whose hands were on the controls of a machine carrying hundreds of lives. She thought about what it meant that her mother flew people through the sky every day, and that some of those people never thought about who was up there doing it, and that some of those people, some Debras of the world, would have an opinion about it if they did. She thought about the photograph in her jacket pocket. Look what I built. The wheels touched down with a small, precise jolt. New Orleans received them. As the aircraft taxied, Marcus Webb looked at his phone. The video was 47 minutes long. He had filmed nearly the entire meal service, the PA announcement, the overhead bin moment, the exchange about the photograph.
His hands were very calm.
He opened his email and began composing a message to the airline's customer relations department. He attached the video. Then he stopped, deleted the email, and opened a different application. Some things, he had decided, shouldn't go to customer relations first. The aircraft reached the gate. The jetway connected. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the cabin became what it always became. The choreography of retrieval, the standing and stretching, the overhead bins opening in a rolling sequence from front to back. Debra Hollis stood at the front of the cabin near the cockpit door. Her posture was impeccable, as always. Her expression was the professional mask she had worn for 19 years. But her eyes, if you looked closely, and a few passengers were looking closely, had something in them that wasn't quite composure. Passengers began to move toward the door. And then the cockpit door opened. Captain Yolanda Clarke stepped out in full uniform. For gold stripes on each sleeve. Hat slightly adjusted, the way it always was after a long flight. She had the easy, unhurried movement of a woman who had just completed a job she was deeply good at, whose body knew how to carry the particular satisfaction of a flight landed clean. She stepped into the business class cabin. She looked down the aisle. She found what she was looking for. Imani had not moved from her seat. She had been the last one to stand, waiting for the crowd to thin, the way she always did. She was standing now in the aisle, her backpack on, her book tucked under one arm, her locks falling past her shoulders with the gold rings catching the cabin light. Yolanda Clarke walked down the aisle. She did not rush.
She did not need to.
The passengers parted naturally, the way they do for people who carry themselves with purpose. She reached her daughter. She put her arms around her and held her with the specific intensity of a person who has been away from something precious for too long. Imani dropped her head against her mother's shoulder and closed her eyes and breathed in the familiar combination of her mother's perfume and the particular, functional smell of a pilot's uniform. They stood like that for a moment that the whole cabin seemed to stop for. Then Yolanda pulled back. She held her daughter's face in both hands, tilted it up, looked at it the way she looked at instrument readings, carefully, completely, reading everything. She had been a pilot for 16 years. She could read conditions. She saw what had happened in her daughter's face. Not the surface. The surface was composed, as she had raised it to be, but beneath that, in the eyes, in the slight tightness around the jaw.
Something had happened on this flight.
She filed it. She would come back to it. "How was your flight?" she asked.
Her voice was very calm.
Quietly, privately, pointedly calm. Imani looked at her mother. And then she looked, over her mother's shoulder, directly at Debra Hollis. Debra Hollis, who had questioned her seat, who had commented on her hair, who had skipped her during the meal service, who had made a PA announcement designed to embarrass her, who had walked past her struggling with her bag while rushing to help white passengers. Debra Hollis, who was standing 4 feet away, watching this reunion with the expression of a person who has just understood the full dimensions of something they can't take back.
"Interesting," Imani said. "Just that."
One word, delivered with the absolute, immaculate economy of someone who has been saving it for exactly this moment. Yolanda held her daughter's gaze for a moment. Then she turned, slowly, and looked at Debra. Debra looked back. Neither woman said anything. In the second row, Marcus Webb, who had never stopped filming, watched the color drain from Debra Hollis's face and quietly pressed a button on his phone. The video began uploading. What happened next unfolded the way these things unfold in the modern world, with speed that has no historical precedent, with reach that makes geography irrelevant, with a kind of democratic, anarchic momentum that no corporation can control once it's moving. Marcus Webb's video went live at 3:42 p.m. Central Time. By 5 o'clock, it had been viewed 80,000 times. By 7 o'clock, it had crossed 500,000. By midnight, it had been shared so many times across so many platforms that the numbers had stopped being meaningful as numbers and had become simply a symbol of scale. This many people, in this short a time, had decided that what Marcus Webb had recorded was something the world needed to see. The video was 47 minutes of largely undramatic footage. And that, perversely, was exactly what made it so devastating. There was no shouting. There were no slurs. There was no single, explosive moment of obvious bigotry that a PR department could isolate and call an aberration. What there was, instead, was pattern. 47 minutes of pattern. The boarding pass check, the hair comment, the skipped meal, the PA announcement, the overhead bin, the systematic difference in how every interaction with Imani was conducted versus every interaction with every white passenger in her vicinity. 47 minutes of what sociologists call differential treatment, the mundane, professional, deniable weaponization of small decisions. And at the 42nd minute, a 2-minute sequence in which a black woman in a captain's uniform walked out of a cockpit and embraced the black girl that her employee had spent the previous 3 hours treating as invisible. The internet had a lot of feelings about this. By the following morning, the airline's social media accounts were in crisis. Their communications team, who had spent Sunday evening releasing a statement that used words like reviewing and taking seriously and consistent with our values, found themselves facing a response that demonstrated fairly conclusively that a large portion of the public found those words profoundly insufficient. The airline's internal camera footage, subpoenaed within days as part of a formal investigation, corroborated everything in Marcus's video and added several moments his camera hadn't caught. Debra Hollis was suspended pending investigation. A formal review was opened into her conduct. Sandra, the second flight attendant, the one who had brought Imani the bread roll and the plastic cup of water, the one who had been present for all of it and said nothing, was also placed under review. Neither development felt like enough to the people watching. But they were, at minimum, a beginning. 3 days after the flight, Captain Yolanda Clarke gave an interview. She had been reluctant. This was documented by multiple people, her union representative, a colleague who'd spoken to her in the days after, and 2 of the 3 journalists who had reached out. She had declined repeated requests before agreeing to a single, long-form conversation with a journalist she trusted and had met before, a writer who covered workplace discrimination and civil rights with the kind of patience and thoroughness that Yolanda respected. She was not interested in performing outrage for cameras. She was not interested in becoming a symbol or a hashtag or the subject of a news cycle that would move on in 72 hours while she and her daughter continued to live in the story. She had a daughter who was already navigating enough, who was in New Orleans eating red beans and rice, and trying to enjoy what was supposed to be a simple, joyful summer vacation, and she was not interested in pulling that child back into the center of a media circus. But she gave the interview. She gave it because she felt, and this was the word she used to her union rep, who had urged her to consult a communications professional before speaking publicly, responsible. She felt a particular responsibility to say what needed to be said in the way that the moment deserved. Not with anger. Not with the sharp, jagged edge of a person who has been personally wronged, though she had been. But with the deliberateness of someone who understood that what had happened to Imani on that plane was not just about Imani, or about her, or about Debra Hollis.
It was about a system.
And systems require clear-eyed testimony, not just justified outrage. She sat across from the journalist in a quiet room, not a television studio, not a press conference, just a room with 2 chairs and a recorder on the table between them, and she spoke without notes for nearly 2 hours. She spoke about her career, about the years of training, the ground school, the simulator hours, the accumulation of flight hours in aircraft that got progressively larger and more complex, the certifications and recertifications, the type ratings, the check rides, the years of first officer service before the captain's seat, the moment when 4 stripes appeared on her uniform and she understood, in a way that's difficult to describe from the outside, that she had arrived at something she had been building toward her entire adult life. She spoke about what that career had felt like from the inside. About the times she had walked into pre-flight briefing rooms and watched surprise move across a colleague's face before they could smooth it away. Not malice, usually, just the reflexive recalibration of an expectation that had not prepared for her. About the passengers who had seen her in the jet bridge before boarding and assumed, based on her uniform and her cap and the 4 gold stripes on her sleeve, that she was a gate agent. About the passenger who had once stepped into the open cockpit for a pre-flight look around, as passengers occasionally do with permission, and upon seeing her in the captain's seat had stopped mid-sentence and said, with genuine and unguarded bafflement, "Oh, where's the pilot?" About how she had responded to that question calmly and professionally, as she had been trained to respond to all unexpected situations, and how it had taken until she was alone in the cockpit, pre-flight checklist in hand, to let herself feel the full weight of it. She spoke about Imani. About the Locs she had started for her daughter on a rainy Saturday when Imani was 6 years old, on the bathroom floor with a jar of coconut oil and patience that she'd had in abundance for that particular project. About what it meant to her that her daughter wore them as she did, not defiantly, not as a statement, just as a fact of herself. A settled, quiet fact. About what it had meant to her when she understood what had happened on that flight, that someone had looked at that quiet, settled confidence and decided it was a problem requiring correction. She paused here for a long time. Long enough that the journalist, instinctively, did not fill the silence. "My daughter sat in that seat for 4 hours," Yolanda said eventually. "She was ignored during the meal service. She was embarrassed over the PA system. She was passed over when she needed help. She ate a bread roll alone while every white passenger in her cabin received a full meal on a proper tray with a linen napkin." She stopped again. She did not complain. She did not cause a scene. She held her photograph and kept her back straight, and she endured it. Because that's what I've raised her to do when the world behaves badly, to endure it with dignity and come out the other side still herself. And I am proud of her for that. I will always be proud of her for that. Another pause. But I want her to live in a world where she doesn't have to. What I want people to understand, she continued, is that what happened on that plane was not an anomaly. It was not one bad employee having one bad day. It was a set of automatic assumptions, accumulated over time, never examined, never challenged, expressed through small decisions that each person involved could plausibly describe as coincidental or procedural if examined in isolation. Debra Hollis did not use a single slur. She did not refuse to let my daughter board. She did not do anything that, taken alone, would be obviously indefensible. She just made 47 minutes of choices that told my 14-year-old daughter that she didn't belong in her seat. She looked at the journalist. My daughter belonged in that seat. She belongs in every room she has ever walked into. And I will spend whatever professional capital I have for as long as I have it, making sure this industry understands the difference between the service it thinks it's providing and the service passengers like my daughter actually receive. The interview was published on a Thursday morning. By Saturday, it had been read in full by an estimated 4 million people, an extraordinary number for a long-form piece, the kind of readership that editors spend careers hoping for. It was shared with long personal captions by people who had their own stories, their own airplane moments, their own experiences of being quietly, professionally, deniably told that they didn't belong somewhere they had every right to be. It was cited in op-eds and social media threads and, within 6 weeks, in testimony before a congressional subcommittee examining anti-discrimination enforcement in commercial aviation. It was not a rage piece. That was the thing people kept saying about it in the comments and the shares and the discussions it generated. It was not a rage piece. It was something harder and more durable than rage. It was a reckoning, delivered with the calm of a person who has spent 16 years flying above weather systems that would make your knees buckle, who knows that the most dangerous conditions are not always the loudest ones, and who has never, in all that time, lost her composure when it mattered most. Imani spent 2 weeks in New Orleans. She sat on Grandma Cecce's porch in the evenings and watched the light go warm and amber across the garden, the jasmine releasing its best performance as the heat of the day eased off and the evening air moved slowly through the live oaks on the street. She rocked in one of the 2 porch chairs, Grandma Cecce's chair, slightly to the left, always slightly to the left, and drank sweet tea and watched the neighborhood go about its evening business. The man who walked his arthritic dog at exactly 7 o'clock, the children 2 houses down who played in the front yard until someone called them in, the couple across the street who sat on their own porch and didn't seem to need to talk, having arrived at the particular piece of 2 people who have run out of things they need to say and have found that this is not a problem, but a gift. She cooked red beans and rice with her grandmother, following a recipe that Celestine's mother had written in a composition notebook that was older than anyone in the family could accurately date. The handwriting faded in places, the pages soft with use, certain annotations made in a different hand that might have been Celestine's mother or might have been her mother's mother, the history of it blurred and beautiful. They cooked together for 3 hours one afternoon, and Grandma Cece talked the whole time about the family, about New Orleans, about the particular theology of good red beans, which required patience and pork and a willingness to let things take the time they needed. About Imani's grandfather, whom Imani had never met and Celestine rarely spoke about in ordinary conversation, but who appeared sometimes in these kitchen afternoons as a full, vivid presence. About the history of the house. About what it had meant to own it, to keep it, to pass it forward. She walked through the French Quarter on Tuesday afternoon, alone for the first time in that particular neighborhood. Grandma Cece had given her a specific geography of safe streets and interesting stops and the one bakery that was worth the wait and the 2 that were not. And she ate a beignet at a small table outside and watched the street musicians and the tourists and the locals who moved through the scene with the easy authority of people who live inside something that other people travel to see. She bought a small watercolor from an artist set up near Jackson Square, a painting of a street in the rain, the colors bleeding into each other in a way she found beautiful, and carried it home wrapped in paper. She wrote about all of it in her journal. She wrote about the flight, too. She had been writing about it since the night she arrived, filling page after page in the way that writers process the world, not to reduce experience to something manageable, but to find its shape, to understand what it meant and what it didn't mean, and what she was going to carry forward from it and what she was going to set down. She wrote, "The thing about being ignored is that it's designed to make you doubt yourself, to make you think, maybe I'm misreading this, maybe I'm being too sensitive, maybe this is just how things are, and I should be grateful to be here at all. I know that's how it works. I've known that since I was little, and I still almost believed it, sitting there at 35,000 feet with my empty tray table. That's the part that stays with me, not what she did, but how close I came to letting it work." She wrote, "My mom has been flying planes for 16 years. She has 4 gold stripes on her uniform. She has flown through weather that would terrify most people and landed safe every single time. And some woman who hands out bread rolls thought she could look at her daughter and make her feel like she didn't belong. There's something almost funny about the scale of that miscalculation. I'm not laughing yet, but I think I might, eventually, she wrote. Grandma Cece said, head up, back straight, eyes forward. Not because the world deserves your best posture. Because you do. I'm going to carry that for the rest of my life. Grandma Cece, for her part, received the story of what had happened with the stillness of a woman who has spent 81 years hearing versions of the story and has moved, over the long arc of those decades, through rage and grief and exhaustion, and out the other side into something that was not quite acceptance. She would have pushed back hard on that word, and in fact did push back hard on it when Imani used it, but was rather a kind of armed, experienced composure. A knowledge of exactly what she was dealing with. A refusal to be surprised by it. And a determination, consistent and lifelong, to deal with it on her own terms and never let it have the last word. She listened to the whole story. She did not interrupt once. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking out at her garden. Then she said, your mother is flying planes through the sky. You're going to write things that matter. That woman is handing out bread rolls. We know where we stand. Imani laughed. Actually laughed, a real laugh, full and sudden, the first one since before the flight. She did give me a bread roll, she said. That was probably the most useful thing she'll do this year, Grandma Cece said, and stood up with the unhurried authority of a woman who has decided the conversation is over, walked into the kitchen, and checked on the rice. Imani sat on the porch for a while longer. The evening light was doing its best work on the garden. The jasmine smelled the way it always smelled on evenings like this, which is to say, like exactly where she was supposed to be. This story was covered, in the weeks that followed, by every major news outlet in the country. It was discussed on morning shows and evening panels and podcast episodes, and in classrooms where teachers used it as a starting point for conversations about systemic bias, the nature of power, and the systems that allow small cruelties to accumulate into large ones without ever producing a single, prosecutable incident. It prompted the airline to commission an independent review of its training protocols, a review that, according to several internal sources who spoke anonymously to journalists, found patterns of differential treatment in customer service complaints that spanned years and multiple crew members, patterns that had been visible in the data for anyone who had thought to look, which until now, apparently no one had been sufficiently motivated to do. The review's findings were not fully released to the public. They did not need to be. The direction of the findings was legible enough in what the airline did next. It prompted a coalition of Black airline employees, flight attendants, gate agents, ground crew, and several pilots to publish an open letter that eventually carried the signatures of over 400 current and former employees across multiple carriers. The letter was specific where most corporate diversity statements were vague. It named practices. It described experiences. It cited incidents with the precision of people who had been documenting things carefully for a long time because they had understood, long before anyone else was ready to listen, that documentation was the only currency that institutional resistance couldn't dismiss. It prompted the International Air Transport Association to issue a statement on diversity and inclusion in cabin service. Whether that statement represented a meaningful commitment to structural change or a sophisticated exercise in saying the right things while changing as little as possible was a question that reasonable people answered differently, and that the passage of time would eventually answer more definitively. But the story did something else, too, something quieter and more durable than any corporate review or open letter or institutional statement. It did what the best testimony always does. It made visible something that had always been there. It did not create the phenomenon of a Black child being treated as a trespasser in her own seat. It did not invent Debra Hollis or the 19 years in which her assumptions had calcified and her instincts had been confirmed, over and over again, by a world that rarely pushed back. It did not build the system that had allowed Sandra to stand by and say nothing without consequences, or the culture that had made the boarding pass check and the hair comment and the skipped meal tray feel, to the person doing them, like routine professional judgment rather than the expression of something much older and much uglier. It found all of that where it already lived, embedded, normalized, functioning exactly as it was designed to function, and it pulled it into the light. This is what the best witness does. Marcus Webb, sitting in 5A with his phone on his tray table and his 3 daughters in his mind, had understood something fundamental, that the world is not changed by the people who have power to change it, but by the people who choose, in a specific ordinary moment, to pay attention, to see what needs to be seen. To be the witness they'd want someone to be if the child in that seat were their own. He was asked about this in several interviews. He thought about it carefully each time before answering. "I have 3 daughters," he said, in the account that circulated most widely. "The oldest is 15. I looked at that kid sitting there alone and I thought, if this were my daughter, I would want someone to see it. And I looked around that cabin and I realized nobody was seeing it. People were looking away. People were looking at their phones. People were doing the thing we all do, which is deciding that whatever is happening a few rows ahead of us is not our business." He paused. "So, I thought, be the person you'd want to be there. See what needs to be seen." Another pause. "It's not complicated," he said. "It just requires paying attention. And a willingness to decide that what's happening in front of you is actually your business. Because we're all in the same cabin. We're all at 35,000 feet together. And if one person is being treated like they don't belong there, that's everyone's problem, whether or not it feels comfortable to say so." The summer Imani Clarke was 14, she flew alone for the first time. She was questioned about her seat. She was told her hair was a problem. She was skipped during the meal service, embarrassed over the intercom, and passed over while a white passenger was helped without being asked. She sat in a business class seat she had every right to occupy and was made to feel, in a dozen small ways that individually could each be explained away and together could not, that this was not so. She did not cry. She did not make a scene. She did not confront, or protest, or demand. She sat with her back straight and her head up and her eyes forward, the way the Clarke women sit, the way her mother had modeled and her grandmother had taught and her great-grandmother had apparently practiced too, based on the evidence of the composition notebooks in Grandma Sesay's kitchen. She held her photograph, and she remembered what had been said to her across her whole life about belonging, and she endured, not passively, not weakly, but with the active, chosen dignity of someone who has decided that they will not be diminished by something that has no right to diminish them. And then her mother's voice came through the intercom. And then her mother walked out of the cockpit in her 4-stripe uniform. And then the reckoning that Debra Hollis had never once considered possible arrived, quietly, without a single raised voice, without a scene, without the kind of dramatic confrontation that would have made it easier, in retrospect, to frame as an isolated incident. It arrived in the form of an embrace in the aisle of a commercial aircraft and one carefully chosen word in response to a simple question. Interesting. The thing is, and this is the thing that Imani wrote in her journal in New Orleans, that Captain Yolanda Clarke said in her interview, that circles back to us in the ending of the story, the justice was not the point. The exposure was not the point. The suspension, the reviews, the articles, the hearings, the open letter, the IETA statement, the independent review that found patterns nobody had previously been motivated to notice. None of that was the point. The point was that a 14-year-old girl with gold rings in her natural locks boarded a plane to visit her grandmother, and a grown woman in a professional uniform decided, from the moment she saw her, that she was worth less. And she was wrong. Had always been wrong. Would have been wrong whether or not her mother happened to be the captain, whether or not Marcus Webb happened to have his phone, whether or not the video happened to go viral. The wrongness was not contingent. It was not retroactive. It existed in full from the moment Debra Hollis looked at Imani Clarke and let her assumptions run. The exposure just made the world catch up to something that was already true. Racism doesn't always shout, Captain Clarke said, in the final passage of the interview that stayed with people longest. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it checks your boarding pass too slowly and skips your row at dinner and makes an announcement about unaccompanied minors when you've been sitting perfectly still. Sometimes it does all of that behind a professional face that has spent decades learning how to make sure nothing can stick, nothing can be proven, nothing requires a response. Sometimes it looks just like good service, except for the one passenger who can tell the difference, because she's the one who isn't receiving it. She looked at the journalist. "The ceiling isn't real," she said. "I've been flying above it for 16 years. I flew above it the afternoon my daughter was on that plane, whether anyone in that cabin knew it or not. And she will fly above it too, in whatever form that ceiling takes in her life, whatever rooms it tries to keep her out of, whatever seats it tells her she doesn't belong in. A pause. Because she does belong. She has always belonged. And she knows it. That's the thing Debra Hollis never understood. You can skip someone's meal tray and embarrass them over the PA and make them feel invisible for 4 hours, and if they've been raised to know who they are, you haven't touched them.
Not really.
Not where it counts. She stopped. Head up, she said quietly. Back straight. Eyes forward. Because you do. And that right there is the story of Imani Clarke and Captain Yolanda Clarke, and a flight that an entire airline will not soon forget. What happens when bias is stripped of its professional disguise? What happens when the quiet endurance of one child meets the public record of one phone camera? What happens when the person you decided to dismiss turns out to be the daughter of the woman flying the plane? Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with a one-word answer and a video that's already uploading. Imani Clarke, for her part, spent 2 beautiful weeks in New Orleans. She ate her grandmother's red beans and rice. She watched the light go golden on the Mississippi. She wrote in her journal.
She grew.
And when she flew home, she sat in her seat, she opened her book, and she let her locks fall wherever they wanted. Because they were hers. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be. If this story moved you, if you felt something, if it reminded you of something, if it made you think, share it with someone. And subscribe, because we tell stories like this one every week. Stories about dignity. Stories about witness. Stories about what happens when ordinary people decide to pay attention. We'll see you in the next one.